The first thing I would like to do is thank you for clicking on this English lesson. There are so many good English teachers out there, and you decided to pick me. So thank you. The next thing I would like to talk about is what this English lesson is going to cover. We are only a few days away from another presidential election. As you probably know, Vice President Harris is going against former President Donald Trump, and everyone is trying to predict who will win. And we do that with something called the polls. We are actually going to talk about 3 different kinds of polls in English. That will be the first topic we talk about. But before we do that, I would like to take a look at a news clip. Watching the news in English is a great way to improve your English. Maybe you are studying for the IELTS or TOEFL exam, but they often use very difficult vocabulary, maybe an idiom, and probably an English phrasal verb or two. We will watch a clip together, and then I will come back and teach you what they said. I have 22 different phrases, idioms, English phrasal verbs for you to learn. Let's take a look at that first clip.
I want to start with you. New polling, lots of early voting numbers.
Yeah, good morning, George. Our new poll with Ipsos has Kamala Harris right now back in front, a 4-point lead, 51-47 in the matchup with former President Trump. That is up from about 2 points nationally a few weeks back.
Let's first talk about polls. I have 3 different words for you: this type of poll, that type of poll, and that type of poll. So we have a pair of homonyms and we have a pair of homophones. Don't you love English? Let's talk about this first poll. In the picture, it looks like this man has just voted and now he is taking a poll. Let's look to see what this kind of poll means. For each of these definitions, I will have a picture, I will have the official definition, and I will use it in a sentence that relates to politics in some way. The definition: polls are surveys where people are asked for their opinions or preferences. So before the election, somebody may come around, maybe to your house, maybe call you on the phone and ask you, who are you voting for? We also have something called exit polls, which this man is probably taking. These are surveys that ask you, who did you just vote for? And the other part of the definition says it's usually about political candidates or political issues. But someone could ask, which peanut butter do you like better? That is one type of poll. Let's use that type of poll in a sentence. Political polls help us see which candidate people like the most before the election. I would like to warn you, and we will see this in the news clip, these political polls are often wrong. People are not exactly honest about who they are going to vote for. Really quickly, if you don't mind liking this English lesson, it helps other English learners find the lesson. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss another English lesson. So this type of poll, a survey, can have something to do with politics. It could have something to do with peanut butter or another product or another issue. But this type of poll always has something to do with an election. This type of poll is a place. Let's look at the official definition. Polls are the locations or places where people go to cast their vote in an election. I teach school in the United States. The school I used to teach at was a polling place. We did not have the day off for school on election day. Students were still in classes, but our gymnasium or our gym was used as the local polling place. Let's use this type of poll in a sentence. Many people went to the polls early to vote for their preferred candidate. Preferred candidate is another way to say which candidate you like better. I have done an entire English lesson about voting early in the United States, and I have used preferred in another English lesson. That word might be review for you. And then, of course, because it is English, we have to use poll with an entirely different spelling. There are many polls in English, but the one I wanted to talk about was a barber pole. Let's make that picture a little bigger and talk about what a barber pole is. A barber pole is a sign with red and white stripes used outside barbershops. It has no connection to political polls, but sounds the same. I can see this appearing on an IELTS or TOEFL exam. The people who design those tests are evil. They try to trick you with different spellings. I tried to use the two type of polls in a sentence, and here is what I came up with. While people lined up to vote at the polls, others lined up at the barber shop with a barber pole outside. It wasn't easy to combine those two types of polls. And I asked AI to create a picture with those two types of polls, and this is what AI came up with. What do you think? Did AI do a good job? AI is getting better every day, but it still has a long ways to go. I wasn't happy with that one, so I asked AI to redo it, and this is what they came up with. AI still has trouble with spelling for some reason.
I want to start with you. New polling, lots of early voting numbers.
Yeah, good morning, George. Our new poll with Ipsos has Kamala Harris right now back in front, a 4-point lead, 51-47 in the matchup with former President Trump. That is up from about 2 points nationally a few weeks back. But they may not look exactly what it seems to be, because if you narrow it down to the battleground states, it is a good bit tighter.
In the newscast, they used the phrasal verb narrow down. Narrow down means to reduce the number of choices to a smaller number. Back in the spring, there were something called primary elections. At least for the Republicans, they had a few different candidates to choose from. Their choices were eventually narrowed down to Donald Trump. It was a different story with the Democrats. I don't want to get into that too much. It's a little controversial. But out of all of the candidates trying to become president, we have narrowed it down to only two. And now we need one. Let's look at a sentence using the phrasal verb narrow down. Voters must narrow down their choices from many candidates to just one. I don't think anyone would want to vote for both Harris and Trump, but when you go to the polls to vote, you can only vote for one.
Yeah, good morning, George. Our new poll with Ipsos has Kamala Harris right now back in front, a 4-point lead, 51-47 in the matchup with former President Trump. That is up from about 2 points nationally a few weeks back. But they may not look exactly what it seems to be, because if you narrow it down to the battleground states, it is a good bit tighter. Checking out our 538 battleground state polling averages, you see Harris with a narrow lead, but that is actually a little bit smaller than it was a few weeks ago. Donald Trump now up in 5 of the 7 battlegrounds, but it is so close, all well within the margin of error.
Margin of error. Every time a poll is taken, there is a margin of error. Let's talk about what that is. A small amount that shows how much the poll results might be wrong. The poll shows candidate A leading by 5%, but there is a 3% margin of error. In the news report, they say that Harris has 51% of the vote. Trump has 47% of the vote. I am an English teacher. I am not a math teacher, but that poll has a margin of error of 2%. So that means Harris could have as little as 49% of the vote, and Trump could have as much as 49% of the vote. So even according to that one poll, those two candidates could be dead even. That is another way to say they are exactly tied.
Donald Trump now up in 5 of the 7 battlegrounds, but it is so close, all well within the margin of error. President Biden's approval rating in our poll just 36% and clearly a drag on Harris.
In the news report, they mentioned that President Biden has a low approval rating. That means the American people don't approve of him. They don't like the job he is doing. And that is dragging Harris down. She is the vice president for the president. They are kind of linked. They are kind of put together. Let's look at the official definition. To make someone or something less successful. If President Biden was really popular, that would help her. He's not very popular right now, so that is dragging her down. Here's a sentence using drag you down. A scandal could drag a candidate down in the polls. President Trump has had many scandals. Sometimes it drags him down, sometimes it makes him more popular. I asked my friend AI, please give me the 10 lowest approval ratings in presidential history, and they did just that. So we have the president with the lowest approval rating ever, Harry Truman, with 22%, and that happened during a very unpopular war, the Korean War, and also a struggling economy. So money issues weren't great in the United States. Number 2, Richard Nixon with 24%. That was back in 1974. Nixon's rating plummeted. That means went down really quickly. Plummeted due to the Watergate scandal, leading to his resignation. He is the only president in U.S. history to resign. In other words, he quit. He said, I can't take it anymore. The heat is too much. Too many people don't like me, so I am leaving. George W. Bush, not too many years ago, 2008, 25%. Guess what? During another unpopular war, Jimmy Carter, 4th lowest approval rating of all time with 28%. I just talked about him, I think in the last English lesson. Something to do with his debate with Ronald Reagan. But yeah, and I did talk about the Iran hostage crisis. High inflation. We also have high inflation now, low presidential approval rating. I wonder if there is a connection.
Donald Trump now up in 5 of the 7 battlegrounds, but it is so close, all well within the margin of error. President Biden's approval rating in our poll just 36% and clearly a drag on Harris. As for early voting, more than 41 million Americans and growing have already cast their votes. This is a larger share of Republicans overall voting earlier than 4 years ago. Not totally a surprise because Trump told his supporters last time not to vote early and has changed his tune somewhat this time. In some battleground states, we
changed his tune. They used that in the news clip talking about President Trump. During 2020, he told his supporters, don't vote early. Now he's changed his tune. He's switched the way he thinks. Let's look at the official definition. When someone changes their opinion or way of talking about something. Here's a sentence. After losing support, the candidate changed his tune about tax policies. And I picked this picture, 2 women. In the picture, they look very happy, but maybe just a couple hours ago, they were fighting. If that is the case, well, they have definitely changed their tune. They like each other now. They had an argument, but now they've changed their tune and they are friends again.
Not totally a surprise because Trump told his supporters last time not to vote early and has changed his tune somewhat this time. In some battleground states, we have some fresh numbers in Michigan where the first weekend of early in-person voting just finished, and you can see the number of Republicans, likely Republicans, growing year over year. Now 39% of early voters. There's still more Democrats, but that is a shift.
Year over year. This means comparing the same time period from one year to the next. Support for the party grew year over year by 10%. I don't think that is true for either party. I don't think either one is getting that much more popular year over year. I think they're pretty much staying the same. Another idiom here. It's a shift, a change in opinion or position. It's a lot like changing your tune. The new poll results show a shift in public opinion towards environmental policies. Environmental policies, that means taking care of the earth.
And you can see the number of Republicans, likely Republicans, growing year over year. Now 39% of early voters. There's still more Democrats, but that is a shift. And in Arizona, we actually see more likely Republican voters than likely Democratic voters. Again, a shift from 4 years ago. But a lot of these votes, though, seem to be people that vote in every election. It's still too early to say who's going to win this election because the people that are going to determine it probably haven't voted yet, George.
And Rick, more than ever before, perhaps in this election, it's unclear what the impact of this national poll really is.
Yeah, and just to go back to our poll, 47% for Donald Trump. Well, to give you a sense, he got 46.1% back in 2016, and he won that election. 4 years later, he got 46.9%. That's 47% almost exactly, and he lost that election. So it could very much still go either way. And if we all know that the polls were off last time around.
Imagine that. The polls were off. That is another way to say the polls were incorrect or didn't match the final outcome. That is true in almost every election. Do not believe the polls. Everyone was surprised when the polls were off by a large amount in the election. Nobody should be surprised. They are always wrong. They are always off.
This is the electoral map with the battleground states not assigned right now. It wouldn't take much of a swing, though, in the polling to have a big swing in the Electoral College. If the polls are off as much as they were in 2020, if they understated Trump's support all over again, this is what we're looking like. Trump with 312 electoral votes. But if they're off in the other direction, if they're understating Harris, much like they did in 2022 for Democrats, this is what we're looking like. So this may seem counterintuitive, but it's where we are. The polls are so close, it shouldn't come as a surprise to have something of an electoral landslide in either direction.
Landslide. I did a couple English lessons about a month ago about hurricanes, and in that English lesson, I mentioned landslide. But when we talk about politics, landslide is only an idiom. A landslide victory is a win by a large number of votes or a big difference. I'm going to make a prediction right now before this election. It will not be a landslide victory. This is going to be pretty close. The presidential candidate won in a landslide victory, taking 80% of the votes. We haven't seen that in the United States in a long, long time. Probably back in the 1980s when President Reagan won by a landslide victory. I think in 1984, he beat somebody named Walter Mondale by a large amount. I was curious about it, so I did look it up. Yeah, the electoral vote, that margin was huge. I've talked about the electoral vote before on this channel. The popular vote was a little closer, but that's not how we elect our president. Remember, it's a winner-take-all kind of thing with the Electoral College. States do not split their vote. A big swing. That means a large change in support or opinion. There was a big swing in voter support after the debate. I've talked a lot about swing states on this channel, so if you have been watching me for a couple months, you already know this, so I will be brief. But these are states that don't always vote Democrat or Republican. They go back and forth with each election. And the swing states that we have now are Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. States like California, a big state, it always votes for Democrats. Texas, another big state, it always votes for Republicans. These states, you never know exactly who is going to win that state.
And if we all know that the polls were off last time around, this is the electoral map with the battleground states not assigned right now. It wouldn't take much of a swing, though, in the polling to have a big swing in the electoral college. If the polls are off as much as they were in 2020, if they understated Trump's support all over again, this is what we're looking like. Trump with 312 electoral votes. But if they're off in the other direction, if they're understating Harris, much like they did in 2022 for Democrats, this is what we're looking like. So this may seem counterintuitive, but it's where we are.
Here is a very tough English word, but don't worry. I will explain it. You will understand in just a couple minutes. Counterintuitive. Counterintuitive. One of the hard parts is pronouncing this word. It means something that doesn't seem to make sense at first. Counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive that people voted for higher taxes, but they did. Something that doesn't make sense. Take a look at the woman in the picture. She is studying, right? Some people think the longer you study, the more you will know something. But that can be counterintuitive. Working longer hours can actually make you get less done. After a certain amount of time, working too many hours can make you feel tired and stressed, which makes it harder to finish tasks. That's why in my classroom, the class lasts for an hour and 20 minutes, but we take breaks every 20 minutes. Your brain works better when it has breaks. Cramming for a test the night before. In English, in that way, cramming means studying for a long period of time. Cramming doesn't work. It's better to study over short periods of time, taking breaks often.
It's so hard to know where things stand, where things actually stand right now. Let me bring in John Carl. John, you've been covering Donald Trump even a lot longer than Rachel Scott, more than 2 decades. You went to Madison Square Garden.
Longer than Rachel Scott's been alive, I think, yes.
In the newscast, one of the men says that he has been reporting longer than Rachel Scott has been alive. I did a little research on Wikipedia and found out that Rachel Scott was actually 31 years old. She is another reporter for ABC News. So if he has been reporting for 20 years or 2 decades, he says, not quite as long as Rachel Scott has been alive. And since I mentioned ABC News, I do want to caution you about something. Sometimes the news is very biased. I've talked about this before. You can't always trust the news source. Fox News is made for Republicans, CNN is made for Democrats, and guess what? ABC News is also made for Democrats. To figure this out, I use Ground News, and that is today's sponsor. With Ground News, I can find out which topics are popular in US news. Right now, of course, Israel-Hamas conflict is big. And of course, Election Day is going to be a big one. According to this news source, Harris takes lead over Trump in Iowa. That is one of our states. And I can also see which news sources are covering the story. If I click here on ABC News, I always look at this, factuality. Like, are they telling the truth? Yes, they do that often, but they do lean left, which means they do favor Democrats. They are more likely to talk badly about somebody like Donald Trump. Just something to keep in mind when you are watching the news or reading the news. If you would like 15% off Ground News, check the comment section. There is a link you can follow. I use it all the time. Madison Square Garden. It's kind of crazy, but President Trump just held a rally at Madison Square Garden. New York is a blue state. They always vote for Democrats. New York City is very blue, but Madison Square Garden is a large arena, and Trump was able to fill it with supporters. That seems almost impossible to do. Maybe it does show how popular he is. Who knows? Maybe his team paid people to come to Madison Square Garden to support him. I don't think so, but that does happen sometimes. Let's talk about what Madison Square Garden is. It's a famous arena in New York City, often used for events. Next month, I will be going to Madison Square Garden to see my favorite band, Dave Matthews Band, perform. The candidate gave a big speech at Madison Square Garden. I think I mentioned Madison Square Garden in the last English lesson too. Sometimes you will hear Madison Square Garden called MSG.
Madison Square Garden was packed. People waited hours to get in. They sat through hour after hour of this rally. They were fervent in their devotion to all things Trump. Trump has created a movement. There is no doubt. I cannot think of another Republican figure of my lifetime who could have come into a democratic city like New York and put together anything like that. That said, this was an incredibly dark event. The motivation was there was love of Trump combined with hatred for his perceived enemies, much of it racist, sexist, as the New York Times called it, a carnival of grievances, misogyny, and racism.
Fervent. It is a good adjective to know. It means showing very strong feelings. When it comes to soccer, of course, there are a lot of fervent soccer fans. Let's use fervent in a sentence. The candidate has fervent supporters who go to all their rallies. I think that is true for former President Trump. You can see a lot of supporters waving flags with his name on it or wearing MAGA hats. I've talked about MAGA hats before on this channel. English phrasal verb, put together. There are many ways to use put together. In the picture, you can see those two people are putting together a piece of furniture. But put together can also mean to organize or prepare something. For example, she put together a party for her best friend. She organized it. The team put together a plan to increase voter turnout. The man, I don't know his name, but he seems to really not like President Trump. He used the term perceived enemies. Perceived. That means you think about something, but it might not be true. Let's talk about what perceived enemies are. People who are seen as opponents, even if they may not actually be. Former President Trump loves to talk about people who are against him. He says the media or the news is often against him. And when it comes to ABC News, I do think he's right about that. The politician talked about his perceived enemies in the media.
The motivation was there was love of Trump combined with hatred for his perceived enemies, much of it racist, sexist, as the New York Times called it, a carnival of grievances, misogyny, and racism. And there was nothing, George, nothing in this event that was designed to try to convince people that aren't already totally enthralled with Donald Trump.
And that's how it defies modern politics. But you look at the setting, Madison Square Garden, New York City. You look at the crowd, as you talked about, solid core, mega crowd. It actually showing a fair amount of confidence in by the Trump team.
Look, and I've had a number of conversations with Trump over the last couple of weeks. He's incredibly confident. His team is incredibly confident, and they are laying the groundwork for the idea that if they were to lose, the only way they could possibly lose is if it is stolen. They believe they are winning.
Let's talk about these two words together, sexist and misogynistic. Both are adjectives meaning almost the same thing. Sexist, treating someone unfairly because of their gender. This could work against men or women. The candidate faced criticism for making sexist comments about women. In the picture there, that group of men could be saying sexist remarks about women. That woman in the picture does not look happy. And we have another picture of a group of men and a woman not looking happy. But when we talk about misogynistic, this only applies to women. Men saying bad things about women. The official definition: showing dislike or prejudice against women. When I hear that word prejudice in English, I think prejudge. So even before you know the woman, you judge her. You may say, oh, she can't do a great job because she is a woman. That is a misogynistic statement. Misogynistic, not easy to say. Here's a sentence. Some people think the politician's remarks were misogynistic. Enthralled. In that picture, it looks like the woman is enthralled in her book. Enthralled means deeply interested or excited about something. The audience was enthralled by the candidate's powerful speech. If you are still watching this really long lesson, I hope you are enthralled with my teaching. Let's look at a sentence. I hope you are enthralled in this English class. Laying the groundwork. This is an idiom. In this picture, they are actually laying the groundwork. They are laying bricks, and if you are going to build something on top of this, you want to make sure the base or the bottom is strong. Let's look at the official definition. Preparing for something important that will happen in the future. If you laid the groundwork for a successful study session for English, you would remove distractions, maybe find a quiet room, make sure you are well rested, make sure that you aren't hungry or thirsty so that your brain is prepared to learn. We're almost ready to elect our president, so these campaigns hopefully laid the groundwork long ago. This is something you do at the beginning of something. The team is laying the groundwork for a strong campaign. Congratulations, you made it to the end of a very long, very confusing, very advanced English lesson. I hope you now feel more confident about these terms we discussed. You can always rewatch it as many times as you need to. If you are looking for more English lessons, right down there is an English lesson I did about this election. Americans are going to the polls early. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.